disappointing. I was like, you hear nothing. He goes, what is this? I go, wow, that is like super aggressive on this information. Just came in, or you didn't want to sit with us? No, I was just using the rest. Oh, thank you. I feel like I don't want to jinx anything because it seems like you guys are easy it makes me sick to my stomach.
Good morning. First, I want to thank everybody for attending. It's really important the things that we're doing. My name is Rich Hedges. I'm a member of the San Mateo Central Labor Council and the United Food and Commercial Workers International Union, and also on the board of Housing Leadership Council. I want to tell you how much I appreciate the attendees and sponsors who are here today and have made this possible. Now more than ever, we really need to provide housing for those people that live in this county and do the work and make it a more equitable place to live. This particular workshop is affordable housing and development on government land. And it's very needed, and we do have available land. And our moderator today is Scott Nakatari. He's very well known in the area and very knowledgeable, and he's going to give us a lot of good information. But without further delay, I want to have Scott take this over. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you. So before we get started, I'm curious, but I just want to understand who's in the audience. So by show of hands, who here works for a developer, residential, single-family residence, multifamily? Maybe about eight or nine people. How about anyone who works with a government agency affiliated, whether it's the county, the state, local? Okay, about almost seven or eight or so. And lastly, this is kind of a broader category, but who here works with the services industry, whether it's legal, accounting, consulting, advocacy, something like that? Great. Okay, kind of pretty diverse crowds, same number, 7 or 8 people. So that was the point of putting together this panel, is putting together a group with people connected to the affordable housing industry, but with different backgrounds, different experiences to get their perspective. And the topic today is developing affordable housing on government-owned land. And the reason this is important is obviously, everyone sees how rents have increased. People can't live close to where they work. It's a major problem. And so developing affordable housing on government-owned land can be a part of the solution. It can't solve it, but there's thousands of acres that the government agencies own that are being underutilized. And so that's the discussion today, because developing on government-owned land is nuanced, and they have kind of benefits, community benefits that otherwise wouldn't be possible, but there's also challenges. And so the format today is each of the panelists, including myself, is going to give a short case study or have some discussion topics about things that they've seen from their perspective. And then after we're done, we could have a Q&A with the audience or online. So with that, let's do some self introductions. William, you
Sure.
want to go first?
Nice to meet you all. I'm Will Eager. I'm the Chief Business Officer for Ravenswood City School District here in East Palo Alto.
Hey, good morning. Jonathan Veach. I'm an executive director at JP Morgan Chase, working in finance. Prior to JP Morgan, I was with the city of Santa Clara. So a lot of kind of the points I think I'll make today, I'll put on my public agency hat, but kind of have good perspective from both public and private for this.
My name is Henry Lowe. I'm an attorney at CMPR, and I've been working in the affordable housing industry for about 17 years.
Okay, and as Rich kind of gave my introduction, but I'm Scott Nakatari, Senior Vice President, Alliant Strategic Development, affordable housing developer. We develop all throughout California. Okay, so I just shared my screen, and before we get too far into the presentation, let's talk a little bit about just generally how affordable housing works, because everybody has heard the term, but let's talk a little bit more in detail. So basically, the fundamental difference between an affordable housing development and a market rate development is an affordable housing development will use tax credits as the equity. So what that means is instead of taking cash flows from the property itself, it uses tax credits to pay for the development. And what that translates to is the property could have lower rents for a longer period of time, like very long, 55 years and over. So then the question becomes, who can be a participant or a resident in these affordable housing developments? And the way it works specifically is you have to income qualify. So if you make too much money, you won't be able to. If you can income qualify, then you could potentially be a resident, although, quite honestly, there's often a long list of people moving into this housing. So an example of this is it's posted on the tax credit allocation committee. Income limits, generally these affordable projects will be in the 30 to 70% range, varying from roughly 55 to 60%. So as an example, someone making in the 70 to 78,000 range would kind of be the middle tier, and as a single person, and that rent would translate for one bedroom to somewhere in the $1,900 to $2,000 range. And I mean, rents are very high in this area in San Mateo. Taking an example, a 1960s market rate apartment is going for close to $2,700. So there's a significant amount of savings. And if you make less, in the 30-35% range, then the reduction is even more. You're looking at $1,000, $1,300. So that's the benefit compared to a market rate. An affordable is going to be much more affordable, less expensive. So this is the case study. This is a project. It's 6 acres, 161 units. It was in Palmdale, and the land was owned by the Housing Authority of Palmdale. You can see there it's 4 stories, three different buildings. And here's the kind of the lay of the land. There was the biggest benefit for this particular project was there was a pool that was right across the street that had been in disrepair for over 10 years. It had a big crack in it. And it's part of a park with basketball courts, with barbecues, and it was pretty much being like a blighted park because this pool was out of commission for so long. And so as part of this project, you can see on the bottom left, we were able to rehab the pool to get it back to operations. And not only the pool, but also to build a new pool building, which was smaller before, but to make it bigger and more usable. And so you can see how things progressed in 2017. This is 5 years ago, but it's up and running now. So that was one of the major benefits of this particular project. And then, sorry, we gotta go to the next slide. Okay, here we go. And the other part of this project that was a major benefit for the community, at the bottom floor in the upper left picture, you can see we built an art gallery for use by both the residents and the community. So they have different shows, music and art related shows. These are some of the reviews on there from Google. It says, "This is a wonderful place for our community to gather and view awesome artwork created by local artists. The gallery has a modern but comfy atmosphere. The staff is friendly too." So it's run by a local nonprofit and an art group in Palmdale. And so it's been a good success. So now the key question is basically, and it's on every developer's mind, is how do you finance all this, right? Like it's challenging. And so the way we did it for this project was to break the project up into two. So 160 units, basically right down the middle, 81 and 80 units. On the left-hand side, we structured it as a very efficient, 9% tax credit deal, non-prevailing wage. The idea there was, have some soft debt, but not a lot, but make the equity ask very low and try to sneak into the LA County set aside, basically. So it was pretty much opposite to the other side, which was Corson West, which was a prevailing wage special needs project. We put in the pool, which is an added, roughly $3 million of costs there. The art gallery is probably $1.5 million, give or take. But you could see the different kind of capital stack. It starts off pretty close to the same, but the total development costs, mainly prevailing versus non-prevailing, but a lot of the costs was for the pool, some other offsites. You're looking at $12 to $14 million of additional costs. But it was able to be done with the sources at the bottom, on bottom right, MHP, the VHIP, the Veterans Homeless Housing Prevention Program, and LA County funds. So that was the idea. The other part, the reason to break it into two different projects is for lease up, because 160 units in Palmdale it's quite a lot to absorb at one time. And so, this one, they were basically within a 1 year opening of each other, but that was enough time to lease up one and then the other. And now the question is, would this be financeable now? Given today where the regulations and the market is, I think it would be tougher to do the pool, especially. So in the last 2 years, the 4% bond market has gone competitive. Before it was over the counter, any project that's feasible can receive 4% credits, but now it's very competitive. The last round, approximately a 50% win rate. Not impossible to do, but the other major regulation change that has happened is the tax credits are geared more towards projects in high resource areas, certain designations. So places with better school districts, the kind of better air quality, things like that. This project isn't in that area, so it would be tougher to do it. An idea would be potentially to split it into two, some with a market rate side, but make the affordable side a little bit smaller, but it still would have a good chance. It's just not quite as easy as it was before. And okay, and then that was it for the case study. Lillian, do you want to?
Sure. Well, nice to meet all of you. We have a new logo. I should have caught this. We no longer have this horrible looking triangle. If you had asked me, I don't know, 3 years ago if I was going to find myself on an affordable housing panel, I am fairly confident the answer I would have given is absolutely not. I've been involved in land use and school districts for a long time. So before I joined Ravenswood about 2 years ago, I think, I was with Boston Public Schools, where among a couple of other things that, was designing our overall district footprint. So we had a couple more schools in Ravenswood, about 150, and we've seen that decline over time, and we're thinking about how to do that. Before Boston, I was with Detroit and helping think about, that's obviously a district that's seen significant declines. How do they think about their land use? So despite having spent quite a bit of time helping districts think about their footprint, I never really thought about affordable housing, which is kind of remarkable when you think about it, right? I mean, it's just, it sort of speaks to the somewhat silos of government, right? We don't often think about, as this district, trying to solve a housing crisis. It's just not something that we really do. When I arrived in Ravenswood, you know, I think we've obviously seen declines in enrollment over time. And when the district was founded, I think well over 100 years ago, you know, we had a very different sort of vision of what a school was. Our schools are very open, they're on very large lots, they're relatively spaced out. That's not really the model you want for a school now. We don't quite need space in the same way that we used to. And so as we looked around our schools and thought about, you know, how could we use sort of our land differently, we realized we're kind of underusing the space. Two lots in particular come to mind. One is our district office. It's a very large parcel. It's next to a bunch of large commercial buildings. You know, it's a space that 30 people work at. It's a bus yard with 5 buses, right? We could very easily move that to a space that's probably a fifth the size and free that up to do something else with it. We had another lot that's been the flood site, which I think we're going to talk about today, which is a school that we closed in 2011 and haven't done anything with. Demoed the building, and it's just been sitting there. And as Vice Mayor Willison can point out, you know, I think land in Menlo Park is pretty valuable these days. And we've had 2.5 acres just sitting there because we couldn't figure out what to do. And as a school district, you know, we see land and we think school or programs or community centers. We don't think housing necessarily. And so one of the things that's been interesting in this process for us is really learning about and helping our board in particular think about what does highest and best use mean for a school district, right? How do we think not just in terms of, you know, a 5-year financing cycle or something like that, but we're going to be around for another 100 years. If we build something, what does it mean for us to have a commercial office building in one of our sites for 99 years? What does it mean for housing for 50 years? What does it mean to build another school that maybe we don't need? Or maybe like some of our other sites that we're leasing out to a private school. What do all of those things mean in terms of giving the district flexibility so that when students start coming back to Ravenswood and our enrollment booms, we have spaces to put those kids, but also means that we don't have an abandoned lot sitting in a neighborhood for over a decade, right? And I think in this process, which has been very interesting, you know, I think one of the things that's been hard for us is people get involved in school board elections or go work for school districts, not because they really care about housing. They go because they're former educators who care about kids. And so for us, I think part of what we're working on is kind of taking our blinders off and really thinking about how do we sort of look at different options. I think we have a next slide, flood site. If I'm remembering correctly. Take it off.
Yeah.
Great. Well, we're trying to develop a piece of land. Some of you may have heard of it. It is in Menlo Park. It's the flood site. It's this abandoned school that we closed a decade ago. And as we've sort of trying to build, you know, thinking about what the use are, we got our board excited about a project. But for us, part of the way we got there was not saying what makes the most sense on this site, but really trying to bring in someone else to say, what are the options? So we actually brought in JLL to help run a bidding process, and we kept it very open-ended. And so we got proposals not just for teacher housing or just for market rate housing. We got a proposal for a park. You know, we explored working with the city to make a reservoir, but we actually kept it fairly open because we wanted to see and help our board understand all the possible options. When we had that, the board was able to sort of select, you know, this is the most competitive proposal. In this case, it was 80 to 90 units of affordable housing, 100% affordable housing, that would have for the lifetime of the agreement, a preference for teachers and staff. So our teachers and staff, 85% of whom are income eligible to live in affordable housing. Just think about that for a second. 85% of our staff are income eligible to live in affordable housing. Would be able to, whenever a unit comes up or is unsubscribed or open, would be able to move into that unit. There's been a little bit of pushback from some of the neighbors, I would say, just a little bit, but we're optimistic and sort of continue dialogue to sort of find a way to work through some of the differences there. And, we're sort of in the middle of negotiations with Scott and Henry on sort of some of the details of the contract. It's been a whole nother set of learnings. But it's been a really great experience for us, the district, to figure out how to sort of better leverage our space, address the needs of our community in a lot of ways, both the families in our district and the teachers and staff, and take land that's been sitting vacant for over a decade to much better use. So I'll stop there. I could probably talk all day about this one.
So I'm going to discuss a few of sort of from a lawyer's perspective, some of the legal considerations and issues that kind of come up frequently when you're working with a government agency to develop affordable housing. And one of the themes that I want to, that's not listed here is building relationships between the developer and the government agency as well as the community. That's really you'll see as we go through some of these talking points, a lot of what comes through is ensuring that you have a relationship and mutual trust between the developer and the agency. Because as we'll talk about, both parties are entering, a risk, what is potentially, it's a business venture and it has risks. And part of having that mutual trust is being willing to take some of these risks, whether it's political risk or economic risk. And so, the first item I listed is the RFP, understanding the government purpose for this disposition. RFP is a request for proposals. Most public land, they cannot select someone or negotiate the disposition in the smoky back room. It has to be offered to the public, just like the flood site, and and then members of the public will have the opportunity to bid or make proposals as to how they want to develop the land. And the RFPs can vary. It could be an RFP saying, this is a site we want affordable housing. So if you make it a proposal, you might get mixed use, you might get something else, different types of proposals, but the RFP may direct, what the land is for. As Will mentioned, an RFP could be open-ended. This is land, be creative, tell us, convince us that your plan is going to make sense. And when you have a housing purpose as a developer, having that relationship is important. And I would also add, having effective advocacy and community advocacy in that area is also important, because that advocacy is advocacy even before you submit your proposal. Is going to encourage the people, the staff who are reviewing the proposals, who's making the judgments, the city council, board of supervisors, whoever it is, that will build into their mind an inclination, right, towards affordable housing or something else, because that is what they may hopefully perceive as a need and what their community perceives as a need. And so similar, and also having a relationship with the government agency, particularly if you're a local developer, you're in the city or the county, means that you may get a, very, I don't know how to describe this, but it's important to have open communication with the government agency. You don't want to sort of taint the proposal process, but it's just important to understand when land is going to be coming up, what the government agency's perspective as to the land is, and that will help you, submit a successful proposal. Now, some of these issues that I'm going to go through are very legally dense, so I'm just kind of skim them over, but they're things you just want to keep open in the back of your mind. Related to the purpose of the disposition. If they want housing, if the government agency is saying, I want affordable housing, developers send me proposals. Two things you have to worry about is restricted property and or think about is restricted property and right of reverter. So if they want housing, they will put on some sort of agreement on the land, most likely saying this land can only be used for housing. And they will want to address the foreclosure risk, because if theoretically, if the lender forecloses on the property or for some reason it's not successful, the agency can lose that purpose, that housing purpose. The lender will foreclose, sell it to the highest bidder at auction, and that person can do, will develop how they and operate how they want to develop and operate. So many government agencies will want an unsubordinated restrictions, meaning it's going to be senior to any lending. And that's going to affect your underwriting with the lender, because now if they sell it at auction, it has to be sold as an affordable housing project or site. That's obviously going to limit, who's going to bid and how much they will bid for the property. So that's going to affect your financing for the property. Similarly, because the government agency is often selling the property for a purpose, they want that purpose achieved, and if it is not, they want the land back. There's a couple ways to do that. One is through a right of reverter, where they sell the land, and there's a deed restriction that says if you don't build the housing and lease it up within a certain period of time, we're going to take the land back. And that's something you have to also address with your financing parties, because they don't want to put in money into a project that may disappear. Another tool is a ground lease, where basically they remain the owner of the land and they lease the land to the developer, and developer builds and owns a building. In ground leases, it's very, and a lot of government agencies like it because they know that in the long run, they'll get the land back. Right? Whether it's 55 or 99 years, eventually the land will come back. The project, the improvements will come back to the government agency. And then, let's see. One of the issues that you'll have to think about is the price versus value. I'm kind of jumping down the bottom. Important consideration when you're dealing with an agency is that there is a California prevailing wage law. And if they sell or dispose of property to you for less than fair market value, then you may have to pay prevailing wages for the development, construction costs. Now, different factors will feed into that. There are appraisal strategies. If the land is restricted to only affordable housing, that's obviously going to suppress the value of the land, that will help you, because, versus buying land from a private party, right? Most private parties, their motivation is, I want to sell the land for the highest price as quickly as possible and then move on with my life, right? Working with the government agencies, they will become a partner in this project. They want it to be successful because they see this as a public asset, and it's going to generate public good. And particularly in a ground lease situation, you will have an ongoing relationship with the government agency. And if in 20 years, when you need to rehab the building and borrow more money or re-syndicate the project, get more tax credits, you may need to extend the lease. And so you're going to be asking the government agency for more. It's going to be a new negotiation, potentially new negotiation. And you want to make sure that you have a good working relationship, that the project, they view the project as successful and they want to continue it. A lot of government agencies want the housing, but they're not they're not housing property managers. They don't want to necessarily manage housing. In fact, a lot of housing agencies have disposed of their properties or put it into the private operations because they don't have the capacity to self-manage a lot of assets or properties. And then last one is soft power. Again, the relationship. The government agency can help things. They can help. They'll know the right person in planning to talk to get your entitlements go a little bit faster than it might otherwise go through. It's always helpful to have someone in the government on your team partnering with you and advocating internally for this project. And then one thing that's not mentioned here is timeline. As I mentioned, government agencies think on much longer timeline. They will outlast pretty much every developer that you know of, no matter how successful the developer is. The city is going to stay, the county is going to stay, the state and the federal government are going to remain, whether or not the developer does. And so they tend to be also more patient with the property. They may, as you know, there are multiple rounds of financing, but you may not get the financing in the first, second, maybe not even third round. You may have to wait another year for another HCD, supernova. And most private developers aren't going to want to wait more than a few months. Many government agencies are going to be much more patient and understanding of that financing process, and just be more patient about the disposition.
Sure. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience in Santa Clara, kind of from a public agency standpoint, and then I think kind of weave in some insights from private lending. My background originally was finance, so I worked in finance, I did banking, and then I went back to grad school for a master's in nonprofit public administration. So a lot of my career in housing started in New York City with the Department of Public Housing, working for developers in New York. And then I came out to Santa Clara in 2017 to manage the city's affordable housing pipeline and program. And so I was there until really June of this year. So I started at Chase just a few months ago. So most of my experience is really public administration. And when I started, there were a number of parcels in the city, and the council really wanted to prioritize developing those lands through RFP and getting housing on the sites. And so that was the big initiative. We didn't really have money at our disposal in terms of resources to put into housing, but we did have land. And so it was a good place to start. And we were successful pushing those projects through. Henry was our outside legal representation for the city. So I got to know Henry really well through that process. And I feel like a lot of the points you made were specific to some of our projects and kind of resonated with me. So, I know, Will talked a little bit about the government agency perspective. And this is, somewhat of a laundry list. So it's, on Henry's slide at the bottom, there was this legal disclaimer. It's not non-exhaustive and they're all kind of interactive. So I would add that to my slide as well. There's no kind of real order to it. It's somewhat of a laundry list of things I experienced developing land in Santa Clara, but each one of these points, I think we can do a separate breakout group and really go into detail on, but I feel like just kind of throwing them out there, making a few points on them, and then we can go into Q&A and kind of go deeper potentially. In terms of community outreach, I think you really can't start your community outreach early enough these days. And it's going to be part of the process from start to finish. So you really need to prioritize that. I think, the projects are getting really complicated these days with CIDLAC, with financing, with land use and community benefits. And, as a government agency, it's really your responsibility to try to internalize that and simplify the message so the community can keep up with what's happening. I know in our experience, at the city, we talked about controlling the narrative because especially these days with social media, you have Nextdoor, you have Facebook, other channels. And so if you don't put the message about the project out first, it takes a life of its own. And there's parts of it that are true and there's parts of it that aren't. And once that gets into the community and gains momentum, there's really no going back. It doesn't matter kind of what happens from there. So we learned that the hard way a little bit, that you need to be transparent and kind of along with the developer, because it's, like Henry said, when it's city-owned land, it's your project too. And so you have to take ownership of that and kind of control the narrative. Number two is very similar. So the transparency piece, it ties into the city council as well, kind of educating the council and the community. I think with transparency, and building trust and support, there were two things. In all of our project, there was, we always worked with community-based organizations who were stakeholders in what was happening, but there was always a handful of individuals as well who I identified that really kind of helped control the movement within the community and organize the community. And so it was important to identify those kind of individual stakeholders and include them in the process. And I think number two was actually not just listening, but actually implementing some of what we heard was important. Once you start implementing feedback, you start gaining trust. And you can't implement everything, obviously, but there's always low-hanging fruit, on each segment of the development where you can implement those changes. And once those changes are implemented, people feel like they've been heard. And now you have trust in the process. You have kind of engagement, for the rest of the way. Number three, in terms of understanding feasibility and finding balance, I think what was interesting for me is, when you work on when you work with housing advocates are going to want maximum density and lowest affordability for the project. And not everybody in the community, but a lot of people are going to want the lowest density and kind of the highest affordability and most benefits. So you have conflicting kind of interests there. And I always felt like the goal was to find a balance between all of those pieces. And I think one of the takeaways was when you find balance, everybody might not be happy, right? Both parties are going to be unhappy because they're not getting what they want. And sometimes that's a good thing because it really means you're kind of leaving where that balance is for all interested parties. The other point, in terms of surplus land, so I'm not an expert in surplus land. You can talk to Henry about it, but I think it's important. It changed the landscape from when I started in Santa Clara, it wasn't out there, so we weren't going through the process, but kind of towards the tail end of my time, it started coming up. And I know there are good projects out there that went through a process and maybe didn't comply all the way with surplus land and had to start over, or maybe lost a good project because the process wasn't followed. So generally in affordable housing, when you have 100% affordable housing, you're probably going to be safe, and surplus land is a good thing because it's taking land and putting it into the affordable housing pipeline. You just want to be sure you're not missing a step along the way. So talk to your attorneys about that one. Programming the RFP. So Henry talked about the RFP. I think that one of the main things about the RFP is I always felt like you want the whole range of responses in an RFP, right? You don't want to put it in a box, but at the same time, you have to really understand what your resources are, because the resources the city has or the public agency determines what the ultimate product is. For example, the more money the city's putting into the project, you're going to get lower affordability potentially. If you have no money to put in the project and just land, you might end up with some higher affordability levels. And so you don't want to waste everyone's time, exploring infeasible projects. So I think part of the RFP process is really understand your kind of asset evaluation, what you can bring to the table, and be clear about that to developers so they can take that and be creative within kind of the guidelines. Land use entitlements, just the only point I would make on land use is that it's constantly changing from state legislation through, and it trickles down to our projects really in terms of streamlining. So taking away discretionary approvals that you might need or not need. It's important to kind of track that with the developer. And I think in terms of density bonuses and parking, so that comes up on every project, and understanding how it relates to kind of different, whether there's general plan amendments or rezonings and how all that fits together. Community benefits, I think I've touched on a few times, but the main takeaway I think in some of our projects, Henry, was how do you document your community benefits? They're going to get negotiated by the community and the council. And I felt like as working in a public agency, it was how do you document it so it lasts the lifetime of the project, right? It can close and you have an agreement, but there's a lot of things that can happen. So on our projects, we didn't have a community benefits agreement template at the time. So we did CCNRs, but we spent a lot of time on the CCNRs to make sure the community benefits were documented well and that they would flow through the life of the project. And the other piece was the operating piece, because it's expensive, right? So they might be able to fund, in this case, it was an urban farm that was created and some placemaking events around there. You didn't want to have it funded for 5 years and then go away and be unused for 30 years or 40 years. So we spent a lot of time building reserves into the project to make sure those community benefits were funded for for the long term. Ground lease, Henry mentioned, this was an example I learned in New York when I started in housing, and we went to some of the more gentrifying neighborhoods in the city, so the Bronx and Brooklyn. And the city back in the 80s did land disposition for $1 and just got rid of it because there were buildings burning down and people didn't want to live there and they just wanted to get rid of the land. And so when I went on my tours at the city, 30, 40 years later, everyone's like, wow, if we only ground lease this land, it would be, it'd be coming due and we would be able to change these neighborhoods and kind of, program it, because the value changed in a way that no one ever could have expected. So, our areas here are different, but it's always important to keep in mind getting that land back for the city, because it will come due. We won't be here, but somebody else will be thankful that you structured it the right way with the ground lease and kind of ensuring permanent affordability. That's the only way to get permanent affordability. You can't structure a project right now for permanent affordability, but as long as the city has the land, you always have leverage for that. A couple more points here. So with SIDLAC TCAC, what happened with, so if you don't, SIDLAC is the California Debt Limit Allocation Committee and TCAC is tax credits. And when I started at the city, I didn't know a whole lot about it because, as Scott said, it was basically as of right. So as a public agency, you didn't have to think about it. Once it got competitive, it's really important at public agencies to understand how your project fits in SIDLAC, because that's the only way for it to get funded. And so Scott alluded to this, but there was a change in policy where land is kind of designated as highest resource. And if it is, you have kind of a clear pathway to getting your bond allocation. If it's not, you can't control that at the city. You can't change the designation of your land. But you can help the projects be really competitive on the tiebreaker. And so we've done that on some of our projects where in the project where there was a community farm, by bifurcating it, so taking all of that community development out of the project, and it kind of lowers the total cost of development. So the affordable piece was more competitive, but we were able to structure all the community piece separately, kind of through forgivable loans and grants. So that was kind of how we had a few projects get financed. And then kind of last couple of points. So leveraging partnerships. Obviously, there's external partnerships. We worked really closely with the County Office of Supportive Housing in Santa Clara to get Measure A funding for basically all of our projects. But internal, I found that when you're developing government-owned land, the city is a stakeholder and it's your land. So we spent a lot of time with some of the biggest value you can add internally is working with planning and building permits and water and sewer and expediting approvals. Once there's buy-in from your teammates that, hey, this is city-owned land and we need to make a deadline. I know developers were really appreciative of how you can kind of streamline and move things through the process internally. And then last 2 points. So marketing and leasing. It's funny, you go through years and years of this development and you build the housing. And if you don't get marketing and leasing right, and the people who are meant to live there aren't living there, it's all kind of a waste. And it's sad to say, but it's a really important piece that, when you get to marketing and leasing, you're understanding fair housing. So you're outreaching to the people, whether it's different languages or different demographics, that you're hitting people who really need to live here. And then you have to have really good policy in terms of your regulatory agreements, your rent restrictions, and monitoring and kind of auditing property managers and how they lease up, because there's people who need the housing and there's always anecdotal stories about, hey, this person's making so much money and living in affordable housing, how did they get in? And that will happen. I don't think it's foolproof, but there's a way to really focus on it so the right people are kind of getting into the housing. And then last but not least, I think this is kind of the biggest question because we're talking about government land and a lot of cities don't have a whole lot of land left. So it's like, what if you don't have land? And we had some interesting projects where I think a lot of cities now have inclusionary housing, or should at this point. And so inclusionary housing is just saying, there's a set aside of all your residential development that goes into the affordable pipeline. And developers can fee out of that. They can pay impact and in lieu fees. And they don't want to pay the fees because they're high, and they don't want to, a lot of times market rate developers aren't going to want to operate affordable on site. Different property managers, sometimes you have regulatory agreements, and if they're not versed in that, they would prefer to do market and kind of satisfy that obligation offsite. So what we did on a number of projects was kind of have market rate developers get out of their inclusionary obligations by giving equity to affordable developers and doing 100% affordable. And the reason that works so well is because they actually will end up paying less, because you can leverage that money with tax exempt bonds, tax credits, and other resources. So they can make an affordable housing project that otherwise wouldn't have happened by putting in less. If they just cut a check, there's no leverage there. So it's kind of a win-win where market rate developers like it, they can pay less, and you can get more in terms of housing units in the city. So that's a good way to kind of leverage a government asset if you don't have land to kind of produce affordable housing. So sorry, I know I talked a lot, but that's
it. Yeah. Okay. So that ends the presentation portion. So if there's any questions or, I saw you. Oh, go ahead.
Just building off what you said, Jonathan, what you said about the last point about inclusionary. So when the developers work, when a market rate developer gives it to a nonprofit, are they carving off a portion of the land of that project and then dedicating it to the affordable housing developer? So it would still be on kind of the same site, or is it for a totally different?
Yeah,
site?
it could be both and all. I think you've seen it sometimes if it's a master plan development and there's room, it will happen on the same site, and that works the best, I think. So typically when that happens, I think you'll see the market rate developer convey the land at a nominal fee, or to the affordable developer. And sometimes there's also subsidy too that goes in from the market rate developer to make it happen. But we also have examples where the land's not available on site and we do it off site. And so the negotiation changes a bit because land is valuable and different neighborhoods have different land values. And so you don't want to take, you know, market rate development that's in a high resource area with lots of amenities and then put your affordable housing in somewhere else, or maybe it's a transitioning neighborhood where it just was rezoned from commercial to residential, doesn't have the amenities. And that's okay, but you might negotiate more in terms of the units you're getting or density. So there's always kind of a give and take, and all options are on the table, but you're trying to maximize what the city's getting out of it. Yeah.
I have a comment as well as a question. Comment is that I'm not here in any of the capacities you asked about. I'm here from League of Women Voters Housing Caucus. Everybody, the recurrent theme that everybody has spoken to is the need for community education and familiarity with what's going on. So I urge all of you who need to do this, get involved, engage with the League of your local League of Women Voters, and that's what I'm here for. The question has to do with, I'm also new to the area, so I'm less familiar with what's available or not available. It's my understanding that Lockheed's land is still federal land. If it is, then that does relate to what I do know about, because I moved here from Oceanside, which is bumped up against the largest marine base in the, as far as I know, in the world, but certainly in this country. And we kept trying to push for ways to access huge quantities of land available there, and we didn't succeed, but that's another that's another topic for what that community was about. The fact of having federal land being potential is what I'm asking about. Does anybody know anything about that? Because you've been talking about city property, and I'm looking beyond that.
Did you want to respond to that?
I know just a little bit about that relative to, so I'm not involved, but what I would recommend is you look into the agreements that are in place at Moffett Field,
Yeah,
which through the NASA facility, that's federal land. And I
Right.
believe there's a pretty significant housing proposal in place that includes either inclusionary or affordable housing. And it's a pretty substantial complex agreement.
Thank you.
The only project I personally know about is actually a project that I'm involved in, which is in the city of Alameda. And the naval housing, former naval housing, which had been closed for decades, I believe, was recently disposed, I think about 3 years ago. And it was basically into 3 parcels, one to a for-profit developer, one to, I believe, Habitat for affordable ownership, and then to the city and its housing authority for affordable housing. And they are working on building, up to 450 units of housing. Hope at least 150 of it's already slated for affordable housing. The goal is to make it all affordable housing if there's enough financing for it, but that's a business decision that hasn't been made. But it does happen, but unfortunately I was not involved in the RFP process, which was, we closed this in 2019. The RFP occurred, I think, in 2009. So it was about a 10-year process between proposal and actually getting the land. So again, you have to have that right timeline, that right perspective. And I think a lot of the other consideration for federal land is that they are so big. You need a lot of financial backing, whether you're a large developer, or if you've got a backing of a large developer or a consortium, but they are not doing, parcels, they're doing huge tracts of land. And so the scale involved just means that it may be that not a lot of small developers get involved unless they're partnering with a for-profit or other developers. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good. Just on this subject for a minute, the Moffett Field project, there's a group in Sunnyvale that's pro-housing that's working on this. They have regular meetings. I'm actually a member. They let people outside of Sunnyvale join. I'm a voting member. because they want to draw other people into this because it's going to affect the whole area. The question I have is there are 3 cities that I sometimes visit, and I've built relationships with the planning directors, trying to find out what they're doing. And Kansas City, Missouri has what I think is an interesting concept that I have not seen in this part of the country. It's called land banking. And they take properties, commercial or residential, that are way behind on their taxes or that have been abandoned. They put them in a land bank, and then they have certain stipulations. In the single family housing, one has to take over the housing and eventually live in it, but to bring it up to code. And they have actually steps that people have to go through. If they fall down those steps, they take the property back. They're not making progress. But they also have a lot of commercial property around downtown because they're revitalizing it. They've let out a lot of it's been housing. So my question is, after explaining it, is there a process here in California for doing that? Any cities trying to do it? I had one city council person tell me that was illegal in California, but I don't know that. But we ought to be looking at that because it seems like a natural way to get land for housing. Any comments?
I'm not that familiar with it, and I do wonder, and this is just complete guessing, it may be a function, as Jonathan mentioned with the New York experience, it may be more feasible in an area that with, declining property values versus most of California, where its values are skyrocketing and there's always going to be a buyer, and it will just land in a government lap because of unpaid, property taxes or something like that.
That's actually the case in Kansas City when
Yeah.
it started. It's because of what they've been doing, it's turned around quite a bit.
Yeah. And so a lot of, like Jonathan said, a lot of it is the government agency at that time seeing this potential opportunity in the long run, even though in the next 5-10 years, it may not make sense. It may make sense in 20, 50, 30, 80 years.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. We looked at it in Santa Clara, and I think one thing we found was, when you have cities, kind of the smaller cities in the Bay Area that are historically zoned for single family, a lot of the properties that were showing up, at least on the tax delinquent list, were zoned single family. And there wasn't anything where we can put an assemblage together big enough to really do large scale housing. So it was a lot of work and effort for single family homes. And we didn't really have, we had a home ownership program for affordable, but the scale wasn't really there. So, but I think to your point, especially the commercial properties, that landscape's changing in a lot of different ways. And so getting a hold of those properties could be interesting. And, cities have RDA, so they have assets that have flown, kind of like legacy assets that have transitioned through. And I know City of Santa Clara has done well with that as well. So I think part of it is the single family zoning. Part of it is that, asset prices are so high here that you don't have so many showing up on the delinquent status, but maybe commercial's interesting to look at.
Thank you. I think he behind you has a
Sorry,
question.
speaking behind you. Thank you very much, everybody. My name is Ben. I'm a policy fellow with the Partnership for the Bay's Future, supporting the city of East Palo Alto, so we should definitely check in. I wanted to ask kind of a sort of big picture umbrella question that's kind of related to a lot of the points that people have been bringing up, which is just to have us walk through some of the best practices for optimizing value capture among the sort of public sector entity. I think that one of the things that can be challenging is, and this is my somewhat speculative, intuitive experience, is that sometimes folks underestimate the leverage that they have when negotiating. And so I would be curious, for me, when I hear about, the advantage of having like an in lieu fee that enables folks to pay a little bit less, and then that money can then be leveraged for other public sector resources. That's great, but then that congests the pot of these other public sector resources. And that's one of the challenges that we're facing, right, on both the 4% and 9% sort of tax credit sort of pool. And so I'm curious if there are best practice considerations for value capture from the public sector's perspective.
I would almost start that by just certainly don't have best practices, but I would just start by how difficult it is to even figure out what the best value is. Is a park a better resource than 5 apartments? What about 50 apartments? What about a really nice park? What about a pool? What about underground reservoirs to address climate change? I mean, there's so many I think one of the reasons that we as a public agency get stuck is you hear horror stories about, hey, New York just gave the land away or put in a land bank for $1 40 years ago, and how short-sighted was that? What an idiot CBO they must have had. And you know, when we're negotiating these ground leases, I lose sleep over, oh my God, in year 90, if this happens, you know, where Scott's like, I'll be dead, it's fine. And so I certainly, I feel like for us, it's really been a struggle with our board to identify what the best use is and what the biggest community benefit is, just because, you know, as a school board, as a school district, we're so focused on educating kids. That's our best use of all of our land is that. And once you say, well, we're not using this land for that, the possibilities of things we could address are so limitless. And so difficult, I think, from our vantage point as one government agency to really understand what else the city's trying to do. And so for us, you know, it's like, oh, there should be a park, and the city's like, well, actually, we're gonna renovate a park over here. You're like, oh, we haven't been going to the planning commission meeting, so we didn't know that. And when I hear, you know, questions about federal land, reusing a marine base, I'm thinking, you know, I don't know who the head general is who oversees land use, but I'm thinking that guy's thinking in 50 years, I'm gonna be wishing I had that marine base back because now we're out of space. And that kind of stuff so trips us up on how we're doing this. It really is just, it's a struggle of, you know, I think people advocating and saying we actually need more housing is probably the best practice to help policymakers really understand eligible uses, because it's not natural to us as a school district, and I think as other government agencies. Can't speak for the Marines, but that's my guess.
Yeah, I'd say then from a kind of a developer's perspective to capture value, I mean, there's number one, the long-term ground lease, like 90, 99 years is something that government agencies would be more open to, and you know, you do preserve value with that structure. The other that I've seen and have done on deals is the value of the land gets appraised, and you basically structure a seller carryback note from, so the government, so let's say the land valued at $4 million would be structured as a residual receipts note, so that, and for a long term, maybe 55 years. So that way the government agency retains value of their land. They get, you know, it is potentially like a 3% below, relatively below market, but it does, yeah, like every year, and maybe it just depends how big the project is and so forth, but you could get some percentage of the net cash flows. And so, but at least you have the note, and then if there is a liquidation event at some point, then it would get presumably monetized or paid down, at least partially. Appreciate that. Yeah.
I think, I just say, I think one of the answers to your question is, you know, when you're negotiating from the public side, I think, you know, you've maximized highest and best use or public value when the developer kind of walks away and then comes back. Like, I'm joking, but like that has happened, right? Like we've pushed a little too far, and it's like the deal might go away. And then we finally put it all together. It's like, I think we've probably maximized our leverage here. I mean, it's true, you know, you kind of know when things get to that point. But I think your question's a good one, which is there's parts of it you can quantify, there's parts of it that are more qualitative, right? So a lot of the numbers you can bake, you know, when you build a park or a farm, it's, you know, there's more aspects of it that you can't quantify, and it's a good question. Yeah.
Yeah, I had an actually interesting transaction, and this was during the financial crisis when I can't remember which city, one of the East Bay cities actually declared bankruptcy. And we were working on a project in a nearby city, I think in St. County. And it was on land that we're talking with the city about disposing, and their inclination is we're going to run out of money. We're worried that we might have to shut down departments of the city. And, you know, there was a huge budget crisis. And so they, you know, people are thinking, we're just going to sell it. You know, it doesn't matter who buys it. We just want the most money possible just because we need, we're worried about money. And, you know, one of the things we talked about is, well, what happens to that money? You know, after you've got a pot of money, and the other concern, one of the concerns was that it could essentially, because the money could be wind up being diverted to whatever, 5 years, the city council decides, it wouldn't be committed funds, it would just be general funds. And they wanted to preserve housing stock and the housing program. And so what we negotiated with them was actually a ground lease that we couldn't guarantee it, but we felt very confident, as best you can, that we could provide them with a stream of income that would basically subsidize the city operations for the next 30 to 50 years. And that, because it was a stream of income, you couldn't lose it. It couldn't be misspent, or not misspent, but spent on something else or taken by a creditor or whatever it is, right? So that's how they decided to structure it, because the city felt that this was in their interest and for the long run interest of the city to do this. And as with the ground lease, they will still get the land back at the end of the ground lease term. So that was an very interesting discussion and really, really difficult time for everybody, developers and government agencies.
School districts, different authority approval, right? And
We have an elected school board that's independent of the city. And that varies a little bit,
in terms of land use.
well, just in terms of governance structures. So in Boston, everybody reported into the mayor, which actually made it a little more coherent with stuff like this. Whereas in East Palo Alto, the city council is completely distinct from the school board.
And then from the developer perspective, isn't there, so it's not the local planning and building enforcement, or is it?
It's the same.
It would still be. So we can build certain things on district land through the school board without going through local planning, like a school. But we couldn't build housing or a grocery store without going through the local planning commission.
And then the preference, how do you provide a preference without?
Violating the fair housing.
Yeah, that's always.
Talk to your lawyer. But it's feasible and it's doable. You just have to be very, very careful. What I have always said is, when you're a private developer, you want to accommodate that, but at the end of the day, as a developer, you're the one carrying the risk, right? And whoever's leasing up.
Talk about the
Yeah.
state legislation.
Oh, yeah. So for instance, there is state legislation that specifically says it's tied to, because the tax credit program, for instance, has a general rule that says, if you want these tax credits, the housing has to be open to the general public. But they do allow you to give preference or restrictions to that are consistent with federal and state programs. So California adopted a teacher housing act, basically, and it literally says this is a state program for the under the housing tax credit, federal tax credit code, because we want this ability to preference and restrict for teachers.
Teachers and staff.
Teachers and staff, yeah. District employees.
A question to Jonathan's point earlier about value capture in the context of, negotiate until they walk away and then hopefully they'll come back. But what I've seen from my perspective on the private side is sometimes what will happen is an actor will walk away and then not come back, and no value is captured and no housing is created. Or they will not walk away, they'll accept the conditions, and then the market changes and they can't build. Like, there is a significant amount of approved housing in the Bay Area. They cannot be built now. Interest rates were 2% a year ago. Now they're 6, 7 plus. And so, is there a way to balance it? Is there a way to study feasibility? Is there a way to, find compromise to some extent where it's not quite so adversarial?
Yeah.
And
then on another kind of statement as well as a question is that what it seems is that we hear a lot that there's a need for more housing, and often you kind of tax the thing that you don't want. But to build housing, we often kind of tax housing, inclusionary policies, which are very important, but relative to things like commercial linkage, where you can generate housing money from office space or other things. How do you think about the balance of putting burdens on housing and especially affordable housing projects?
I almost wish I didn't make the comment because I said it as a joke, but because it has happened, but it wasn't. I don't think it's a best practice, and I don't think that's the solution. But I mean, ultimately, the solution is, to really understand the developer's perspective, right? You need to understand the economics and really what their constraints are, and trying to bridge that, right? Because you have, at least at the public agency, you have the city council, you have the community, and you have the developer, and everybody has different needs. So I think you're right. You do have to run feasibility studies. Some of it can get complicated, and you don't have to push them that far. There's a way to understand when you're getting close to maximizing leverage and what's out there. But and if you don't have the resources at the city, you bring in there's a lot of good economic consultants out there and financial consultants who can come in, study the underwriting, study the pro forma, and give you good guidance and advice about where that balance is. So that was a joke. It has happened. I'm sure it's happened in other places, but there's a better way to do it.
Can I add something on that? 'Cause I actually, we're negotiating a couple of real estate deals, and culturally, we're so used to union negotiations as a school district. That's how we negotiate. And I've never been involved in a union negotiation where somebody didn't storm out of the room at some point. It's like it's a rite of passage. And so when you get to these real estate deals, we put out an RFP and we got the bid back, and they were like, well, this is the best offer. And I was kind of like, bullshit. Until someone storms out of the room, it's not the best offer. And there's an expectation with our board that if the deal is about to blow up or they're not protested or something, you're not really negotiating. So I actually do think there's almost like a cultural norm where the developers kind of need to go in with the expectation that the school district's going to retrade, an expression I learned in this because it's so common in our negotiations. But there's sort of I think there's actually a fundamental cultural difference almost in how negotiations are done that explains part of that. And I can't speak to the second part of the question, so I was going to cut you off.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the second part. There's a lot there, but I think in terms of, one of the things we saw at the city, and I think a lot of people in the room probably know this, is that cities do better in terms of revenue from different assets, right? So they don't make as much on residential because a lot of the taxes go to, in affordable, there's either a low amount of taxes or in market rate, it's going to the county, and they do better on commercial and office and other assets. So there's a lot of costs that go to providing services to housing. So there's a lot of things kind of going on there in terms of the economics and kind of financial piece of it. But I think, it's the same thing about the balance. What's the right level of affordability for inclusionary, and what are the right fees? And the market's changing right now because costs are going up, but rents aren't. So it's hard because, I think a lot of the policies that you saw implemented were kind of implemented at the top, right? So a lot of high fees and asking for a lot. And I think that's good for the industry, but now the market's changing. And so you have to be flexible, I think, with policies to go back and rethink what makes sense in this environment right now, because deals aren't penciling and there's a lot of other constraints. And I'm not sure if I answered it or kind of what the other piece was, but I think, to some of the other questions, I think one of the good points to make is just that, a lot of this community development is happening within the context of housing. Because with housing, you access the tax credits and the bonds, and you can do community benefits and some commercial. And if you lose, so housing's the priority always. And when you lose the housing, you might lose everything else. So when you're thinking about highest and best use, I think you're always coming from the point of how do we get the housing built and make sure that is solidified? And then what else can we kind of layer in underneath? Because I know a lot of times in negotiations, we get caught on, we got caught on, 5,000 square feet of commercial retail and lost the whole deal almost. And you kind of lose sight of the bigger picture. So I think prioritizing housing, I've heard it before, but that's a good approach. And then kind of filling in the picture as you go. Yeah.
I was wondering, so are you saying that you anticipated this kind of resistance from the yes on Measure B? Or what went wrong? Was it, like you mentioned, the first thing that was so important was community outreach. So was that was there a failure there, or, and then my follow-up question is, if yes on B wins, will it still be built, these 90 affordable housing units? And then the third question, if you don't mind, is the construction that's going on in El Camino, right next to Stanford Park Hotel. Did Arriaga, I think, is the contractor, I'm not sure, that's what I heard. Is there affordable housing there, or did they pay their way out?
That's probably for me. You know, one of the things that's difficult about a public agency is, especially with a school board that, or a school district that doesn't do a lot of development. You know, we put out an RFP that was intentionally flexible. We did not go out and say, we want this, and this. We know exactly what we want. And in doing that, we have to do that publicly. That has to be a public process for us. And so there was a little bit of the sausage making around what do we actually want that I think was done publicly before there was a full project. So I think in a normal development project, you can kind of come up with what you want to do and then have a pretty robust engagement timeline and process and rollout strategy about what it's going to be. In a public agency, you know, that's all happening in public. And we're saying, you know, we think we want this, maybe it's this, maybe it's this. And that kind of ambiguity creates the opportunity for people to take information and kind of run with it, right? And there was a point where we got a call. I didn't know about a density bonus when we started this. And somebody was like, well, you have a density bonus, you can build 250 units. And it was like, we never wanted to do that. We never even thought of it. We didn't even know we could do that. And that kind of messaging kind of got away from us. So in terms of, was the messaging tight at the beginning? Absolutely not. We still don't have a formal contract. We still don't have a project ready to submit to the city. And I think in that sort of absence of definitive information, it's very hard to come up with this is exactly what the project's going to look like. Here's how we're addressing sightline views using delicately distributed trees. And so I think that's been fairly difficult. In terms of the specific impact of Measure B, it's a law that exists one other place in California, I think. In that place, Saratoga, nothing's been built with a law like this. So, you know, is it a constitutional law? Unclear, right? I think it would very likely contribute to increased segregation, and I think there's a clear sort of path towards declaring it unconstitutional through that and through some of the other state bills of how sort of this is blocking basic development. Are there other state remedies? Are there other paths the district can take? We're exploring every option we can. So I don't know. Honestly, if Measure B passes, I think it would definitely significantly dampen the likelihood that this project would go forward, but it wouldn't eliminate it. We're still sort of got other paths forward. And as for the other project, I have no idea. I don't know.
I'm the vice mayor of Menlo Park, and that Stanford project does have some inclusionary affordable units, not very many. It was approved way before I was on council and before we tightened up some of our inclusionary policies. But it's unfortunately a very minimal amount of affordable.
Can I also weigh in, because I was on the housing commission when that was approved. That was a real disappointment because the housing commission wanted more affordable housing, and Stanford said they wouldn't do it, and the city had already negotiated a development agreement because they got other things out of the development and they didn't prioritize affordable housing. It was sickening, to be honest, because it's one of the best places to put in affordable units, a huge development right on El Camino, access to great schools, shopping, everything. It was, I think we ended up not approving that, not that the city council could listen to us on it, because we were all so disgusted with it. I'm still so angry about it.
All right, we're running short on time.
But Tamika, did you have something?
Yeah, I was just curious about how you all feel around SIDLAC and TPAC's interpretation of affirmatively advancing fair housing, because the high resource areas I get, like you want to get people who can do affordable housing in those communities, but it actually, a lot of government land is outside of high resource areas. Oakland, for example, is not a high resource area, and many of the projects that have been serving those communities for decades are not feasible or competitive, given how SIDLAC and TCAC are interpreting AFH. So I'm just curious how that affects y'all's ability to do more development in the areas where in fact people need the housing.
So you bring up a good point about how the regulations change, and that was partially the point of the case study that I was trying to do, just showing you things could still be done, but just not, things would have to be kind of changed and evolved. So on the TCAC high resource area issue, they first came out 2 years ago and they basically gave full preference for all the funding pools for TCAC high resource projects. They got 120 out of 120 points. In this last 2 months, they changed the rules to only give half. So 50% of the pools, because of exactly the point that you're bringing up, that there's so many developments in non-TCAC high resource areas. Flood Park is in the TCAC high resource areas, but like Palmdale wasn't. So maybe now that might have a better chance. So it kind of ebbs and flows, but I think a lot of people made the same comment you did, and CIDLAC did take that into account. So it constantly, and who knows where it'll be in the next 5 years. Yeah, right.
Thank you so much. And there's a wide variety of salads and sandwiches. Just grab one.
Very good, Scott.
You're my emotional support. Tracy. Sorry. Thank you for being here. That was my manager.
Yeah, I was like really interested in hearing that.
We give you money.
It's funny.